Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it is my honor to welcome you all to this conversation with Ambassador Shirin Tahir-Kheli. Named by Newsweek in 2011 as one of the 150 women who shake the world, Ambassador Tahir-Kheli is an expert on South Asia, nuclear non-proliferation, and the United Nations. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli joined the government in the Reagan administration. She quickly rose to the position of Director of Near East and South Asia Affairs. She earned the title of Ambassador from her work between 1990 and 1993 as the alternate United States representative to the United Nations for Special Political Affairs. Under President George W. Bush, she served initially as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Democracy, Human Rights, and International Operations at the National Security Council. And in that capacity, she proposed and coordinated the building of Children's Hospital for Treatment of Cancer in Basra, Iraq. She later became the Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs at the National Security Council and the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State for United Nations Reform. Ambassador Tahir-Kheli took a leading role on women's empowerment under Secretary Condoleezza Rice, overseeing the work of Women Leaders' Working Group, establishing the first ever office focusing on integrating women's empowerment into U.S. foreign policy and spearheading the State Department initiative for women's justice. I'm proud to note that Ambassador Tahir-Kheli is not only a trailblazer, particularly as a Muslim woman, a Pakistani American in reaching such heights, but she's also a longtime member of the SAIS community. She was a research professor of international relations, and from 1999 to 2002, she served as the founding director of the South Asia program here at SAIS. And she's currently a senior fellow at the school's Foreign Policy Institute. She has been leading the Women Who Inspire initiative, and this is a speaker series that has brought global leaders such as the media mogul Tina Brown and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice into conversations with the Johns Hopkins SAIS community. Her exemplary career in public service is an inspiration, and we are delighted to welcome her back to SAIS today. She will be discussing her memoir entitled Before the Age of Prejudice, a Muslim woman's national security work with 3 American presidents. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Joshua White, who's Associate Professor of Practice of South Asia Studies and a Fellow at the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asia Studies here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Dr. White has a record of exemplary service in government. His most recent appointment was during the Obama administration at the White House as a National Security Council as the Senior Advisor and Director for South Asia Affairs. So thank you, Ambassador Tahir-Kheli and Dr. White, for joining us for today's event. Please join me in welcoming them both to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I speaking from here first?
Yeah,
So
you speak and then I'll...
from here or there?
Around the podium.
Okay. Thank you, Dean Vali Nasser, and thank you to my FBI and SAIS teams. Everybody's been always, and not in terms of just today, but in terms of the programs that I'm involved with, been extremely helpful, and so I want to take this opportunity to recognize their assistance. I thought I would just read a little bit from the book and give you then a sort of a quick discussion, or at least some points about why this book is perhaps a little bit different. And then, of course, I look forward to my conversation with Dr. Josh White as a follow-on to this, and any of the audience questions that might come up. I see in this audience a lot of people I do know, including a surprise, my son, who is normally in Canada, but anyway, he showed up, so it's a good place. Thank you for the talks, because I got to see my son for a minute, so that. This is from the prologue of the book. The Boeing 707 is cruising at an altitude of 36,000 feet. It is a hot summer day in May. The sky is clear. Suddenly, several people point outside at the appearance of 6 fighter jets flying in close proximity, 3 on either side. Someone inside the plane explains that the fighter jets represent an honor guard to escort the aircraft, which carries special markings. The honored visitor and the 5 accompanying officials inside the aircraft all watch. The official photographer takes a beautiful photograph of the escort. As I watch along with the few other colleagues present, I ponder this special landing in a place of great familiarity. The circumstances of my return are indeed different, but so much of what I will be privy to upon landing is genuinely familiar. As the plane starts its descent, a hushed announcement indicates 5 minutes to wheels down, official parlance for landing. This is Air Force 2, with United States of America emblazoned on its fuselage. It is taking Vice President George H.W. Bush to Islamabad on the second leg of his May 1984 journey to the Indian subcontinent. I am there as an advisor on the visit, as a member of the White House National Security Council staff. Going back to my roots. Born in Hyderabad, Deccan, in pre-partition India, I was aware of my religion from my earliest childhood. Hyderabad was a Muslim-ruled state, though the population was largely Hindu. Hyderabad's nobility was Muslim and lived an elegant and lavish life based on old traditions. Hyderabad was a wealthy state where the ruler, called the Nizam, wanted reasonable education and health access for all his subjects, an uncommon practice in the day. The gold and precious stone mines of the state allowed for spending on public well-being. My maternal grandfather was the Peshi, i.e. first minister to the Nizam. He was an important man in the state's government. My paternal grandfather had lands in Aurangabad in central Hyderabad. When my parents married, my father, Raziuddin Siddiqui, returned to India after completing his education in the UK and Europe. He did his tripos in mathematics at Cambridge University in England and went on to do a master's in Paris and a PhD in Germany. He had studied in the 1930s with the stars of the day, Heisenberg, Dirac, Einstein. His entire education from first grade to PhD had been paid for by the Nizam's government. Merit was universally rewarded, he used to say, whenever I marveled at the socialist bent of the state. I describe a little bit of Hyderabad in my book because I think it's sort of the beginning of one's moorings, of course, but also because it reflected the traditions in which I grew up. Hyderabad, as I said, was a Muslim state, but so many of the educated elite were not Muslims. And my parents' sort of circle of friends included all of those different groups that we came in contact with. So learning about tradition at the same time as learning about getting along with people of different beliefs was kind of central to the upbringing that I was given. And it is one that I've been very, obviously, I mean, one doesn't have a choice about the upbringing one is given, but it was a wonderful early lesson in learning to live in different environments, to deal with different kinds of people. And that came in handy for us as a family because almost clear out of the blue, once Pakistan had been created, my father, who, as I said, was a mathematician and a poet, and so he spoke Farsi, and of course, a lot of the poetry was in Farsi in those days, and Arabic fluently. So he would go to Lahore every year to give to attend a poets forum and also to give a talk at the annual mathematics conference that used to take place there. And when he went there in 1949, the founders of Pakistan just said to him, look, we need you here to help build education in this country. So why don't you stay? So, you know, we come from a tradition of perhaps not being totally clued in. So he said, sure, and sent a telegram to my mother saying, staying in Pakistan, you and the kids should come along soon or some such. And in those days, the relationship, well, why should I say in those days? It's probably even worse now. But even in those days, the level of hostility was fairly high, and the Indian government did not appreciate the fact that he had just decided to go off and stay. And so my first memory of partition of India and Pakistan was as a young child, when one night the people from what used to be called the custodian's office showed up at our house in the middle of the night, or it seemed like to a child, the middle of the night, to separate everything in the house that belonged to my father, right down to his slippers, and take them away as a penalty for his having taken off. Of course, they took the house, etc. also, but that we were allowed to stay in with paying rent. But when my parents moved from India to Pakistan, they were not going as the ordinary kind of refugee from anything. It was a commitment. So it was a commitment to help build a country in a very, very much more alien land than I think any of them had experienced before that. When I'm asked what was the most difficult transition for me personally, I've always thought of that transfer from Hyderabad in central South India to the northwest frontier of Pakistan as perhaps the most stark change, because no two places that I have ever lived were as different as the very highly evolved, elaborate, fussy Hyderabad than Peshawar, the sort of the new frontier of the subcontinent, where to this day, trouble is made because trouble is worth making in many ways. It was open land, the culture was different, it was exciting, it was empty in those days, and there was the settled areas, and there was no man's land, and there was the border with Afghanistan. So my father, whose job, one of his tasks was to build a university from whichever piece of land, I guess, that they were going to put this on, decided that the most open and most interesting land was just south of the border. I mean, north of the city and south of where the border with Afghanistan. So in this sort of, we lived in this initial period. There was a college there, the Islamia College of Peshawar, which maybe Josh has seen, and an old college built in the British times, beautiful place, and the new university, which sprang up from absolutely just a plot of land and dreams. So I grew up in a Pakistan of those early years where around the dinner table, the discussions that occurred were not about what you left behind, but what you were committing to. Even for a young child, it was an extraordinary sort of education about how dreams are sort of concocted and how dreams are actually made to come true. And the parade of people who came through Peshawar, because remember, Peshawar is still considered the frontier, the Khyber Pass is a famous place. So anybody and everybody who traveled to Pakistan in the 50s, which is when I was actually living there, in that part of Pakistan, came to Peshawar. From the Queen to, you know, I mean, various kings and prime ministers, etc., would come through Peshawar. And part of what my father was able to do was to get this interest and sort of harness it into support for building the educational structure, particularly in the Northwest Frontier province, because that was the most backward province in Pakistan. And to get to meet this parade of people, because, I mean, they had to be fed because it's the tradition, right? So they would come in, and our house was the one house that they would come for either a meal or tea. And so I didn't understand necessarily who these people were, except that they were important people. But I got sort of a chance to have a world focus, which was unusual. The one place, and I'm skipping a little bit here, but I do mention in the book is, of all this entire, because people keep asking me, well, if you met all those people, who was the most interesting? And as a child, looking back, my experience in serving tea to Premier Chou En-lai of China, I think it was 54, 56, was perhaps the most nerve-wracking and also the most interesting, because my mother was away. My brother had gone off to Cambridge University to go to college. That's where our family used to go. And my father said, well, since she's gone, would you mind being the hostess? And I thought, as sort of cocky 8-year-old, I said, sure, no problem. So when it came closer to the time and all these important-looking people started arriving, some of the senior people got very nervous, saying, you have to lift a very heavy hot teapot and pour tea into a small cup being held by this very important man. You cannot burn his hand. I mean, there was a lot of give and take, and I managed to do it. And Chou En-lai sort of talked to me about what is it that you want to do, and he talked a little bit about young girls in China, and I had not much information on China, except I knew very little bit that my father told me. And then I sort of thought about it, and I remember saying to him, oh, I'm going to study about the world, because I hadn't thought about it before. And so my father looked a little surprised and said to the Prime Minister, that's interesting, because Shirin talks so much that her mother thinks she should be a lawyer. So anyway, it turned out not to be a lawyer, and did study the world a little bit. But that sort of thing stayed with me, and way decades later, people used to say, well, you've got to go in and brief X on whatever the issue is. And I said, okay, I mean, no problem. And then they said, well, aren't you nervous? I said, no. Firstly, I probably know more about this particular issue than X knows, and that's why I'm being asked. And it's sort of, if you know what you're supposed to be talking about, it's sort of comforting. And if you're an academic, as Condi used to say, we like to talk anyway, so we can wiggle our way through it. I recite that as just a little bit of the early part, but I want to sort of give you a little sort of vignette of why this book. I had never expected to write a memoir, certainly none that included me as a part of any issue or to such detail, or my early life or so on. But I was sort of encouraged to do by a couple of people, and quite seriously encouraged, and one of them was Secretary Rice, who very early in my third time in government in 2003 said to me, Shirin, you need to get down this story. And I said, Condi, I mean, who cares about my life? And she says, no, you really have to do this, because yours is an American story. And that actually was sort of the hook that got me, because the fact is that I don't know any other country where it was possible for someone who came in and became a citizen in 71, went to work for the Secretary of State in 1982, the White House in 84, and became an ambassador of the United States in 1990. Only in America is this possible, and this is my very firm belief. And therefore, I thought, it is true that there are costs to being a first, and in my book I write about some of the serious ones, some of the funny ones. But so it's a particularly, I think, pointed reminder in times when we're not feeling as comfortable, perhaps, as being not sort of an atypical group or person. But this is an extraordinary country. And as I lived out my working years, it sort of was a reminder again and again, because we were just discussing upstairs that when I took the job at policy planning in '82, I did not know anybody in Washington, absolutely nobody. I mean, it wasn't that somebody had known me and Paul Wolfowitz offered me the job. I'd only met him and he asked me to come and talk about a previous book I'd done on foreign policy. But within about 18 months or in fact less than that, about probably less than a year, I got 2 big breaks in the system. And in a system where I was sort of always saying, no, I don't think this makes sense. Why can't we think of it differently? So being sort of the questioner did not cause me to pay a negative penalty. I got 2 big breaks. One was Larry Eagleburger, who was a very powerful number 3 in the Department of State. He was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs went on to become Deputy Secretary and Secretary. But as P, he was absolutely merciless and brilliant. And he was, for whatever reason, policy reason, he decided to give me a break. And I remember even the small things like when I came up through the system, and you cannot work for the Secretary of State, certainly not for the President of the United States, if you don't have certain very high-level clearances. Because for the President, you get to see what you normally have to go to a vault in a State Department to see. And somebody, there's a lot of huffing and puffing and saying, well, never seen anybody who looks like her who's going to get these. Okay, that's not going to change. She's a woman. Okay, that's not going to change. Then they went back to her parents live in Pakistan. And mind you, these were days when the US-Pakistan relationship was quite okay. So apparently this went all the way up the forum, and since I worked at that time at the State Department, it went up the State Department chain, and it went to Larry Eagleburger, and who apparently told these guys, so they've got to live somewhere. And, I mean, it sounds trivial, but it's a huge deal for somebody in a politically important policy job to sort of take a stand like that from somebody he only knew through work. And that allowed for other doors to be opened. But then, of course, the support you get is always balanced, as in every government, as in every bureaucracy. There's always the downers, and I'm now giving you just a little bit of what I have sort of gone through. The challenges are always serious because you're in these very sensitive jobs. And as I was asked at this book talk last week, so do you think you were given more grief because you were from Pakistan, or because you were a Muslim, or because you were a woman? And I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I mean, it's a good question. And I thought about it, and I said, I think it's because I was a woman. Probably. I mean, when I was entering government, the religion was not so relevant as it is today. It was considered, in fact, unique. Some people even celebrated it, or it wasn't an issue. But being a woman was, because I was working in a man's world, and in 1982, believe me, it was very much a man's world. And you always got kind of, particularly if you could string 2 sentences in your field together and make some sense and didn't agree with somebody's viewpoint, then that made it even more difficult. I remember one of my early times when I was in some very sensitive briefing, and we had the Marine was checking clearances as we went in. And there were about 19 people in that room, and I was the only female there. And as the lights were starting to go down for the briefing, because I had a PowerPoint, this 3-star turned to me and said, do you have a clearance? I said yes. So everybody else in the audience who knew me, he had just come in from the Pentagon, felt awkward, I think, because there is a certain amount of chivalry in the world, thank goodness. And so he looked very perturbed, poor man, and said, oh, I thought you were somebody's wife. I said, I am. So, you know, I mean, he kind of, everybody laughed away. And so after the briefing, he came up to me and he said, look, I really put my foot in it. And I said, sir, don't worry about it. It's okay. I mean, this can happen. But look, I'm breaking a mold. It's new. And I'm unfortunately one of those optimistic people who looks at the glass half full. So the fact that I'm here is, you know, these things will happen. And maybe after me, next time you see somebody, you know, who looks like me sitting in one of these, you will ask it differently. So he said to me, if I can ever do anything for you. So I thought, okay, well, never know. So anyway, 2 years go by, and I'm at this point at the National Security Council in charge of the political military affairs issue. So there's a NSC meeting, and President Reagan decides, I mean, it was quite a path-breaking different thing we wanted to go off on. So I'm working this issue, intergovernment, interagency panels, this and that. Everybody comes back and saying no can do, because this belongs to the Navy. Now I shouldn't give you more on who this was, the poor man. But anyway, and they're not going to do it. It's only for NATO, non-NATO allies, no way. So finally I sort of said, who is in charge of this? There must be one person. So they gave me this name, and it's the same guy. So I asked my office, I said, you know, could you set up a meeting for me with him at the Pentagon? He said, really? He's not a, I said, just do it, just do it. So normally, I don't know what's, you know, I mean, at least at that time, you call from the White House requesting a meeting, you mostly got one because you're there as the president's staff. In that time, the NSC was only 28 people. So we had a lot of authority. I don't know about your time, Josh, but 28 people.
It was bigger.
It was bigger. And it was Dennis Ross, Bill Burns, and myself were in the Near East and South Asia office and political military. So I go there, and his aide is mating down by the river entrance and marches me up to the general's office. And he looks at me, and he literally goes pale. But he's very, you know, now he's chivalrous, and they have tea and everything ready. And I said, sir, you remember you said, is there anything I needed? And he said, yeah, you were very nice not to press me on it and make it awkward and go around. I said, I have something I need. So he said, what's that? And he said, that's the payoff? I said, that's the payoff. I got it. So, you know, I found the shock value is there. You walk in, you look like me in this all male audience, then you open your mouth, you can speak 2 words of English, they think, oh, okay, maybe there's hope. And then if you sort of, they know you're a serious person, they know you work very hard because of the jobs you're in, and there's no other option. But if you're not a curmudgeon about it, and that's the sort of model I sort of followed even in international diplomacy, because if you don't beat people over the head, if you have a little bit of humor, a little bit of something, you generally do better. So that was my early takeaway from my time. I'm telling you that because I think it's one of the, and in the course of the work that I did, there were lots and lots of times where being the woman, being the Muslim, you know, being from South Asia perhaps was a little bit tricky, but by and large, I found that more doors were opened than not. And I got to work on issues that were extraordinary. I talk about in the book 2 issues from each of the 3 presidents I served. And a lot of my work in my first iteration at the NSC and also in second, including the ambassadorship, involved working with India and Pakistan to do something quite unique that I don't think has been done at that level, to use the US relationship with each of the 2 countries to prod them into working on a better relationship with each other. It was a very high-level priority issue. I got to travel on presidential missions essentially once a month, leaving Andrews with it was usually an Undersecretary of State and the Deputy National Security Advisor and myself, leaving Andrews on a Thursday and coming back Monday. The good part, of course, was you didn't have to carry your own luggage, but the flying was brutal. But we got there and we were trying to get India and Pakistan to subscribe to and enact confidence-building measures because of the interest at that time in the US in getting the Pakistani collaboration on Afghanistan. That was a selfish interest. And it wouldn't have happened if Pakistan thought there was a two-front war problem, which it does have now, so by definition. So the only existing CBMs, as they're called, the confidence-building measures, that exist between India and Pakistan are from that era, 86, 87, including the non-attack on nuclear facilities. It was something we took out, left with them, went back again, and then finally they signed the deal. And it still can be done. It is not, it was felt, and I feel that way, I mean, having worked on both India and Pakistan issues for much of my life, that better relations between the two, India and Pakistan, serves US national interests. It may be that the power equation today is far different, perhaps, not so far different. It's appreciably more tilted towards India. But the argument that one made in Delhi, and I think that still holds today, that the full potential of Indian development cannot be unleashed unless you have peace on the Pakistan border. Prolonged and expecting it not to break down at the smallest whiff of anything. And I think the Indians got it and signed on to it, and the war didn't end. Of course, the friendship went back and forth, and sometimes was good, sometimes was not, but there was a threshold that below which it did not fall because of the US interest and insistence that it not fall below that. So that was very much a part of what I worked on. The book has sort of the ebb and flow of relations between those two countries. There's a lot of what I happened to become ambassador in New York to at the UN for the US the day Iraq invaded Kuwait. And so my reluctance of going to the UN was that, what was I going to do there? I'm coming off this very high energy job, 6 years on the NSC staff, and what am I supposed to do? You know, just run around from reception to reception. And I remember the second day after he got elected, President Bush Sr. said to me, I'm going to send you to the UN. And I looked at him and being cheeky me said, why? Because I look like I should be in the UN, Mr. President? And he laughed and he said, no, that too, but that's not it. It's the best job in the world, and it turned out to be. And of course, I arrived there the day Iraq invaded Kuwait, so because we used diplomacy as such an important part of the outreach for every resolution that came up, it turned out to be phenomenal, and countries sent their best diplomats there, learned to do a lot of, I mean, and each year when the president would come for the UN General Assembly, he would pull me aside and say, Shirin, was I right? And every year I had to say, yes, Mr. President, you are right. This is the best job in the world. So, I mean, you know, those kinds of things that happened, and the work that we did is in the book. And the last administration that I was in, the George W. White House, there are not that many of us, male, non-male, Muslim, non-Muslim, or anything, who have served 3 NSCs. Or somebody said to me, so how old are you? Because, you know, if you've been in 3, you must be 100 years old, which is probably almost true. But the fact is, I came to the 2003 job with a comparative framework, which is a good thing and sometimes is a tricky thing, because you have a certain sort of expectation of things. And my portfolio in my last job was as special assistant to the president was democracy, human rights, and international operations, which was the multilateral account. I went in, I had not been for the Iraq war, but I went in right after the war, 4 days after it had started, because as Condi said, look, we will need multilateral diplomacy. You have the experience, the connections, and I care. So of course I went back in there. And I saw what the president, I was witness to what was hoped for, and I was witness to what transpired. And there was a huge discrepancy between the two. And in my view, it didn't have to be that way. And so that was the sort of the heartache, watching something that was meant to go different, a certain way, go completely differently. And in the book, of course, everybody has their own list of candidates why this happened this way, and I identify my list. So, and because I think it was destructive, and I was sorry to see it go that way. But the last chapter of the book is on the Basra Children's Hospital, and I'll just give you a 2-minute, because why the hospital, why in the middle of the war in Iraq? When I got to the NSC 4 days after the war started, there was a huge urgency in trying to make a difference, positive difference on the ground. Condi chaired those meetings, which is unusual. In my experience, a national security advisor chairing on electricity availability is unusual. And I'd worked for 6 national security advisors. So anyway, and that was to highlight the president's interest, personal interest in making things better. And then I saw people drag their feet, and it went on and on. But one of the things when she said we need to do something dramatic, and kept saying, well, we want to do malaria clinics, we want to do anti-diarrhea clinics, and I kept thinking, but the supplemental had $971 million for health, which was a big sector that was needed. So I used to travel home, which is Pennsylvania, on the weekends when I could, and stuck in one traffic jam. I called up a very close friend of ours who's was head of neurology at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. And I said, I'm stuck outside in this traffic jam, but can you tell me what it takes to build a children's hospital? So he said, why? I said, I'm just thinking. Anyway, long story short, he gave me a 2-page paper on Sunday night, which I then took back to Condi on Monday, saying, how about doing something in the south of Iraq, which has a very high incidence of children's cancer, 50% mortality rates. This going back to everybody thought the Iraq war, where chemicals were dumped in the soil in Basra, in that region. And children were dying of lymphoma and things and there was no treatment. So anyway, this went up the chain and got approved. To get initially 100 million was not possible, and that story was a sad one. But we did get some and made it a public-private partnership, raised funds from countries that were otherwise not willing to be part of the Iraq operation. For example, I got Spain to give 22 million, which we badly needed at that particular juncture. And the hospital opened in 2010. And the Iraqis have committed 18 million of their own money to running it. It's absolutely state-of-the-art. The equipment was given by different GE, Siemens, and others. Project Hope, which has built hospitals in Shanghai and Krakow and other places, was the private partner. Got the Omanis to train the nurses, because some of the best nurses in Oman were from Iraq. And so they've carried that forward, and the hospital is functioning, and Iraq is now doubling the bed capacity. So it was a chance to do a little bit of what I remembered of the America of the past that I had grown up in Peshawar sort of dealing with. Let me stop there. Come over there.
Please. Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be able to talk with you about your book and your life, and an honor to have someone at SAIS who has such a long affiliation with SAIS. I loved reading the book because it's full of stories of adversity and chutzpah, if I can use that word in this context, and really remarkable experiences of you seeing what needed to be done and tackling challenges. And I have a lot of questions that I would like to start off with, but I'm going to restrict it to two because I know we want to have Q&A. But the first question is about the title and cover of the book that we're looking at here. And not to be unchivalrous, but I have two critiques.
Only?
Of the cover.
Okay.
The first is that your subtitle very much should have been, "Trouble is made because trouble is worth making." Because that, more than anything else, exemplifies the spirit that you brought to your government service.
Trouble?
No, and
Well, that's why they said I was a woman who shook the world or whatever.
No, again and again, you've been willing to sort of shake up the status quo. But the real critique I have, which I'd like you to explain, is the title of the book, Before the Age of Prejudice. Because in story after story, you talk about how people expected one thing of you and found something different, right? And that as a woman and a Muslim and a Pakistani American, you encountered prejudice. So explain to us the title and what it says to you and what it says to us.
Well, I think it's, in some ways, you're right. I tend to not necessarily accept a no when it makes no sense. Son, you didn't hear this from me. But there was prejudice, but as I said, it was more prejudice because I was a female. Now, it's about being Muslim. I'm not saying, I've not personally I'm past the stage where, anybody would get the jollies from being nasty to me, I think. At least I hope so. But I don't think that my story right now in America is easily sort of duplicatable. In part, it is because Muslims at my time were non-events. I mean, it was, it's the Hindus, the Muslims, the Buddhists, there are all those people out there doing this. I think, and I don't mean that the blame for all of this is on the West. 9/11, I think, was a watershed moment and the end of sort of American innocence about Islam, if ever there was, or disinterest. And alas, it wasn't because 9/11 brought something fantastic that, some Muslim architect unveiled a design for a bridge that could be produced for 1/10 of the price of the normal bridge. That would have been something incredibly positive. Instead, it was the sight of these wretched, crazy, Saudis and Egyptians running their planes into the World Trade Center. So the shock of that event, I think, changed the equation in many, many ways, if one were to draw. I give huge, huge kudos to President Bush for his ignoring advice from some of his closest advisors and going to the mosque 2 days later. Because that spoke to people like me, who've sort of totally American by choice, proud of that. This is my country, this is the country I love. So, it gave me space to be still part of the dream. And it was a huge thing that he did. I mean, you haven't seen anybody else do quite anything like that since. Thank God we haven't had to, for that kind of a backdrop. But nonetheless, his willingness to be critical, but to also be inclusive. Maybe that was because he was Barbara Bush's son. I mean, that probably had a lot to do with it, because that's the way he was brought up. So I think post 9/11, it would be very hard. I mean, I hear stories. I don't follow them closely enough, but I hear stories, because one of the things I do in my current life is when I get invited, and I do very often, to speak to young students and their parents, which is a good thing, particularly if they're Muslims, about, and it's usually the girls who are wanting to go and do something and the parents are wanting to get them married or whatever. And so I get trotted out as the odd example to calm down the parents and say, look, let her go and do what. And these are very, very bright, and they were born here. They're Americans through and through, these girls and boys. But they then, and I'm always trying to encourage the best of them to go for public service, because I think it's a very noble calling. It's just incredible. And some of them have actually listened, and then I stay in touch with them, and they write heartbreaking stories about, what they're going through because of the level of suspicion that now exists. They don't have that shock factor that I guess I had. And I'd come already educated, I'd come to America when I was 13 to go to college, so that's unusual. But I was from a different era, from a different group of people. My husband was a physicist. We came by as academics. These are Americans born here, and then they tend to. So I think that, of course, Macmillan, the publisher, was very. This is a title that resonates because it's got shock value, but I happen to believe it. I would not. They had some other ones that were even more interesting, but I said, no, that's a bridge too far. I'm not going to go down that path.
That's great. I do like the title. You, I think, did some of your early academic work looking at Russia and the Soviet Union, and then when you were in the White House, you were very much involved in the U.S. response in Afghanistan to the Russian invasion. And it strikes me we are now back in an era of great power politics, so I'm told, looking at China and Russia and some of these questions. And in some ways moving away from many of the things you write about in your book, a focus on hearts and minds, on engaging sort of society to society. How do you see this shift back to great power politics and those who say that the focus on the U.S. role in the world and people-to-people contact maybe feel, in the post-9/11 era, maybe feels a little bit naive? What do you say to those people?
That contact feels naive, or non-contact feels naive?
The attempt to communicate, the attempt to shape America's view more positively in the world.
Or the world's image of America more positively, also. Well, the term soft power is a more recent term, right? I mean, it's sort of how do you multiply your assets by drawing in the outside world. And I think the thinking behind it was that every American is essentially an ambassador. And every time you send one and they meet people elsewhere, those people have an impact. I want to actually acknowledge and point out to you two amazing, speaking of ambassadors, Shahsan and Ray Mahmood, who are in the dear friends, but I have watched their interaction with Washington and beyond. And it's true that what America stands for as Americans, when they go and talk about America, it makes a difference. And what they bring, sorry to make an example out of this, but I have such respect for you that this is not a thing. And I have never met so many Washington sort of movers and shakers gather in one place and actually break bread together and not get into fistfights as at their residence. Remember we did, of course, they also did the dinner for our conference, because the people to people has its place. I think we've got to a point where we need all of the layers, because in a shrinking sort of foreign service, when it's, the government is much smaller, people will have views on Americans, and in any case. But I think the problem is the sort of either-or approach. You can't really exclude one thing because we just don't have the wherewithal. And sometimes things are better done if they're not done by the U.S. government. I mean, that's why corporations and their contacts, are so telling everywhere, because they have a different kind of channel through which they go. And we tried, I mean, everybody's always trying to harness the 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 people who have the contacts, who have the resources, who are outside government. So I think that the balancing occurs. But you know, in any case, in a 24/7 news cycle, there's room for everything. I mean, I'm not sure quite how you now can compartmentalize who controls what, because it's all out there, right? And even in the from 82 to 2009, the whole approach had changed. The post 9/11 was a very specific reason for doing this people-to-people thing. Looking at what caused it. As Condi used to say, why are these 11 engineers, instead of working in startups in Silicon Valley or somewhere else, figuring out how to fly planes into buildings? What is missing in this? Part of it is the discontent of those people with their own regimes because they were exclusionary, and their sort of posing of that hostility to the US as a power that supports those regimes that are corrupt, seem to be corrupt. So how do you begin to bypass that? Obviously, we weren't overthrowing the regimes. So you begin to sort of start a dialogue with those who are potential opinion makers, opinion molders, so that they can then become our partners in civil society aspect of the freedom agenda. And I think the President and the Secretary of State, others really believe that freedom and democracy in the Muslim world could reduce the level of hostility, would make the societies more dynamic, help 50% of the population, which is womankind there, and would create a sort of a richness of interactions that could not be had absent that. And so civil society was actively encouraged, both from Washington and from our embassies, because the idea was to make it much more inclusive. Some of it worked, some places it worked, some places it did not. I think where it failed in terms of the larger approach, and this is something as I look back, seems even more obvious to me. I think when the promotion of democracy became the rationale for invading Iraq, which became when the neocons sort of adopted that as the slogan when no weapons of mass destruction were found, that took down the democracy agenda. And that's why, as I sort of highlight that in the book. If
you have a whole chapter simply called Vice President Cheney. And
it's a short chapter.
And yes, and it's not a happy chapter.
He wasn't a happy man.
But it's a very important...
Because I think it was a mistake to sort of rationalize the war retroactively, because everybody was so sure there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, although everybody kept saying, and every time Ralph Vaqueos or David Kay or anybody came out with a very deep report saying, no, none were found, they said, got to get a different man, he'll find them. Went through 4, and they all said the same thing, and one of them was very much our guy. So, and once it became that's the reason we went into Iraq, then it also raised the stakes for success for the democracy part of it. Because democracy is not something you can deliver in, with one regime or another. So I think when the justification of the war kind of took it down. And that was my, I sort of saw it sitting in very private meetings, and it was painful to watch and listen to.
Let's open it up to your questions. We have about 20 minutes or so. Sir. Just wait for the mic, please.
Shirin, you shared several, and despite my having worked for said vice president, I consider her to be a wonderful friend, and thank you for your service to our country and this wonderful message. You shared a few of the compelling personalities over the arc of your career that you influenced by being you and what you brought to the table. Could you share one or two of the compelling personalities that maybe challenged or changed the way you thought about what you did over the arc of your career?
That's a very good question. And there were key moments and key people because the trajectory of my profession sort of changed based on those people in a sense. Because I was going to be a professor at tenure at Temple University. I was going to teach political science and not be doing this sort of things. The first person I would say who made a huge impact on my thinking and broadening sort of the angle of my outlook was at the U.S. Army War College. I served on the faculty of that. That is, speak of path breaking, shocking people. Colonel William Stoudemire, extraordinary mind. Remember him, Kazi? He's just incredibly sharp. He taught he was head of the strategic studies section, and he was involved at this was in 1980, and CENTCOM was being set up in its earlier incarnation. And so Bill got me to work with J5 on the regional expertise side of CENTCOM, and to learn working with people at the Pentagon for whom I have so much respect and still do. And in both their brightness and their ability to sort of like laser-like focus on issues that were problems and potentially needed to be resolved. So I got to work on that, and I had no idea. It's one thing to pontificate about when you teach about foreign policy and defense stuff and political military, you have a certain thing, and then you see these people who actually are at the front lines of thinking. It was a very, very important lesson to learn. Of course, I got a ride in the family model of the F-16 as a result of the CENTCOM part, but that was kind of fun, doing it's a vertical takeoff. I didn't do the takeoff, I was just sitting in the back. So he was the first one, and if I had not done that work with Bill, I doubt that Paul Wolfowitz would. I was working on my book on US-Pakistan relations, which was part of a series on influence in foreign policy, because we use this term influence very loosely. America has influence, Russia has influence. And so there was a 13-book series that looked at, I think there were 7 US and 6 then Soviet. And I did the US-Pakistan one, looking at 2 issues, the nuclear non-proliferation issue and arms sales. So I was working on the arms sales part of it, and therefore when I went to the Army War College, it was sort of interesting. And which, having worked with Bill and J5, then when I met Paul Wolfowitz to discuss my book, actually, it turned out the conversation was much bigger. And from Paul and from Harvey Sickerman, a colleague who used to be president of FPRI in Philadelphia, who had been a graduate student along with John Lehman. We were all together at the University of Pennsylvania. I learned about the Middle East and the limits of power. And it was a very first sort of look at, the way people think, well, this was a good option, I wouldn't have done that, I would have done B. Well, there's the things that I got to work in at the NSC, if there were easy options, they would never come to the president, right? So it's always a choice between 2 relatively bad options, most of the time, as you know. So that appreciation, I think I got from their tutoring of the Middle East with me. And I think, and then as I said, Eagleberger was my foreign policy sort of extraordinary person because he challenged conventional thinking. And he made it possible for the times that I did run out against the stream in my government, post-State Department, 84 onwards, much of my government career, to say, no, if I get the facts right and I have the right rationale, hear me out, please. Because here was a man who did that. I mean, of course, as you know, Eagleburger, he also could cut you down very fast if he thought you just up the wrong creek. So that was an extraordinary. And then I went to the NSC. I got offered my NSC job within 3 months of going to policy planning. I thought that was a little indecent. These people had paid for my clearance. I should better stay. So I stayed about 16 months or so. And then when Bush Sr. was going to India, Pakistan, that was the time I switched over because my CBM thing, he wanted to try and do with Indira Gandhi, and we got started on that. So then I shifted. Don Fortier, who died very young, who was an extraordinary mind, that I went actually initially to the NSC to work with. And he died of cancer fairly soon thereafter. Was somebody who made a huge difference in the way I sort of put together my academic plus, now 2-3 years in the government service. So there have been other people. I think Condi Rice was somebody who always, I'm sure she did this with others, but I'd known her going back to 85, but not that well. I'd gone off to New York when she came into the NSC. Gave one a hearing and gave one a chance. She took the Basra Children's Hospital and had to do a lot of heavy lifting because, it's easy to go after a special assistant, doing something. We want diarrhea clinics. And she said, well, we're only asking for $50 million for the hospital. They used up the 971, the rest of it, on anti-diarrhea clinics. And who knows where the money went? At least we have a hospital. So she was extraordinary. And then again at state, this whole idea that we needed to now mainstream women's empowerment, the group of leaders that I was able to get started for her, started with 19. It was extraordinary people like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the 3 prime ministers from Central America. It was just, and the way that grew to 64, and they were all worker bees. They were not there for, people thought, well, these ladies get together and have cucumber sandwiches and drink tea. The last thing that they did. And so I worked with Sandra Day O'Connor on the Women and Justice issue from the State Department. She started for the State Department something that's still ongoing. She actually traveled to Africa to work with African justices, attorney generals and senior level judges on women and justice, access to justice for women. And so these were extraordinary people who stood for something much more than one would assume. And there are others, but these are some that, and I'm leaving presidents aside, I'm just thinking of the others. Scooter Libby I'd put in there. Scooter is a friend, somebody I respected and liked. Had a problem, which I did. OVP wasn't always, you were always kind, but you were always kind. They were always, for no reason except that, you were, and you know how it goes. So I'd go to Scooter and he'd say, oh no, what now? So I say, Scooter, and he'd say, okay, sounds reasonable, we'll do it. So if he hadn't, because at the NSC, the clearance is critical. And I didn't want to do end runs. I wasn't trying, I had no personal agenda. So I needed people on board. And so I was grateful you did, he did, It helped because we were a team. At the end, we all rose or sank together, in a way.
That's great. Let's take a couple questions together because one here, and then if there's a student, think about after this question, we'll take it. Okay, well, please.
Hi, Shirin. I'm Mimi Burke, and I was a student of yours. And I remember you running into class in your power suit, coming from the NSC, and you were an inspiration. You were inspiration to us, so thank you very much for that. But my question is a little granular, and it's about...
See, you always got me in to see the prince.
Yes, yeah, and so my question is a little bit about that. Before the Iraq War, I know Middle Eastern leaders like Prince Bandar bin Sultan went to the White House and counseled President Bush not
Yeah.
to go into Iraq, and other leaders also did that. So could you take us through a little bit of his thinking, the president's thinking about why he did it anyway?
I went in 4 days after, so I was not privy to any of the pre-discussions. But I had, as a Muslim, that he knew I was called in, so I had my 2 cents worth, and I said the same thing, that I said, because, since my son is here, I would embarrass him. When he was little, I'd read him a story, because I was a working mother, right? I'd rush home, dinner, and then we'd have a story. I'd read the whole story and close it and say, okay, Kazim, good night. And he'd say, and then what happened? I said, what do you mean, then what happened? So I actually said that to the president. I said, Mr. President, I'm going to say to you what my 3-year-old son used to say to me, and then what happens? Nobody had any answer. Everything was going to be hunky-dory, but So I suspect, and Prince Bandar was very respected, liked by the Bushes. He was a national security advisor later, but when I knew Prince Bandar, he was the Saudi ambassador for how many years in Washington? 22, yeah, he was. And he was the ambassador when I went on that first trip to Saudi Arabia on a White House plane with the Bushes. And said, you can come to dinner with the king even though you're a woman. And I said, no, thank you, I'll go with Mrs. Bush. But we did a desert hunt, a gazelle hunt.
As one does.
As one does. And so he and I shared we weren't on camels, we were in a Range Rover, I think, anyway. But yeah, that's a whole other thing. I think if we it's easy for me, I'm not the president, and wasn't. To say, look, bad intelligence, no weapons were found, or if they were found, they were done away with before we can, and moved, and then done what we did would have been better than to take the whole democracy thing down, I think, but that's easy for me, right? Not so easy, it's painful, actually. Did you have a question?
Just
experience with spoilers in managing the South Asian instability, like between India and Pakistan during the years that you were working on stabilizing their relationship. I was curious, what your experience was with actors who were seeking to kind of upend U.S. upend any process that would lead towards more stable relations between the two rivals.
You Americans in the bureaucracy, or are you talking about spoilers out there?
Spoilers out there, and just kind of like what efforts were done on the American side to manage such events.
Well, one of the things that was very critical, because it's South Asia, there's always something going on, and it's not always what you predict. So was to have very clear and multiple lines of communication. There was a huge amount of interaction at various levels within, I would have with the chain of people, more senior people would have with more senior. So the US sort of ran interference a number of times because we had credibility with both. And we called, whoever was not doing the right thing out on it. But we also gave both countries' leaders incentives to continue to believe in what we were saying and to work with us on better relations. It was a serious, serious commitment on the part of the Vice President, the President, the Secretary of State. I mean, it was at that level. Actually, the book doesn't have it because of the print, but the electronic version of the book has the documents. Actually, even on this, I think you can sign, you can get on, and I would urge anybody who has the book to actually get on the website that they've cited and read the actual document. The Reagan Library has declassified some of the documents, including my first work at NSC, which was a national security decision directive signed by the president. It's called 147, I believe. Would not have, I only discovered this because when I went to see the archivist for my book, he said, oh, did you know that your papers, a lot of them have been declassified? And I said, really? How nice? Because it takes 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. He said there was a group of Indians who came who were sure that because you were Indian, but then you became Pakistani American, you had done something nefarious with Pakistan. So they wanted all of your papers declassified. And so I said, okay. So they said, except for a few that were redacted because of, they were on the nuclear issue, and that probably won't. But this key item, in which I had done the blueprint for how we could do what I was proposing we do, which went all the way up to the president, because I said, I don't want it to be said that, this woman came in here and did something, is available for reading, and you should read it. It's actually out there. And so thanks to those Indians who thought, and they said they were left very unhappy saying, are you sure this is it? Because I have a huge number, because I didn't have time to sort through, since we were only a 3-person office. So they took everything, including completely useless things like travel vouchers and all that stuff. So they're all in the library there, and once they go there, that's where they stay. So thanks to them, I managed to get quite a lot of the papers out, and they were so nice to me. They said, it's nice to get the author of these, and they photocopied them for me and didn't even charge me the 5 cents a page. It's for all those years of service, they said. I said, well, thank you. But that will give you a sense of what you're asking. It's actually, and it's signed by the president.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I'm grateful for your time, and I'm grateful that you took the months of toil to produce this memoir, to give those of us who are young and who care about the regions of the world that you worked on, the issues that you worked on, and the questions of identity that are still big areas of debate in our country, to give us a roadmap to how you navigated a different era, but navigated it with class and with great success. So it's really an honor to have read this and be able to be here today with you.
Thanks,
If you
Josh.
could join me in thanking Shirin Tahir-Kheli.